debating today are Captain America from Solvista in proposition and Iron Man from Mountview in opposition. The motion for this debate is this House believes militaries should aggressively engage in the genetic and bionic enhancement of consenting soldiers. I would like to call the first speaker of the proposition, Professor X. 5, 6, 7, 8.
Rebellion! 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 Buka!
Today is So we may all be able to sit in this room and cheer and have war cries as if we live in a utopian society where everything is just the way we want it to be. But the issue at hand is that there is a problem that exists, and that is the problem of war. And we think that this type of war exists because with other issues such as inequality, and we think that we as side proposition, our aim in today's debate is to try and mitigate the harms that exist that come with war, and all in all try to mitigate the harms that war also has. And we think that with research into bionics and also genetic modification of humans as soldiers to try and mitigate these wars, it would lead to a net detriment of society. So the motion for today's debate that Delano does not know is this House believes that militaries should aggressively engage in the genetic and bionic enhancements of consenting soldiers. So we as side proposition define the motion in terms of aggressively as researching with force and determination in order to succeed. And when we speak about genetics and bionics, we are referring to the enhancements as the science of changing how a living creature develops by changing the information of its genes. So what we as side proposition aim to prove to you in today's debate is that super soldiers are a legitimate intervention in war and results in better war. What I as first speaker will be speaking on is in terms of accountability and the nature of war. And our second speaker, which is Varoshan, will be speaking on the government's approach. So we think that it is necessary to precisely outline how the implementation of this notion will actually occur. Thus, our policy states that in order for us to actually allow for this research into bionics and the modification of genetics, we think that we need to look at when we're actually going to approve the intervention of these bionics or modified soldiers, if I can call them that for short. So we think that in order for this to occur, we need to look at it in terms of efficiency. Will bringing these soldiers into the playing fields of war create a more efficient way in terms of mitigating the harms of war and also mitigating war on its own? And secondly, we need to take into consideration, considering that the detriments of war are that many lives are lost, is the introduction of these soldiers going to ensure that less lives are lost in the long run? And also thirdly, we think that we need to also look at it in terms of the speed of the war, because obviously no one wants a prolonged war. So we think that it is important that we take into consideration whether or not the war will be mitigated cheaper and faster. And when we speak of, and so to further elaborate on this, when we speak about in terms of efficiency, we need to look at it in terms of how, on a more realistic approach in our status quo, how war happens anyways. And we also need to highlight, maybe Siyabonga, this is what you want to ask, but we need to highlight how unfairness currently exists in our society, as much as side opposition may lead us to believe that it doesn't exist. So we think that when one country is able to come into the playing field with the AK-47, while I use a gun, a normal gun that South African policemen uses, we think that that's a first indication of that unfairness actually exists in our society. And furthermore, what we say to you as side proposition is that resources also have a role to play in terms of how much or how huge of a capacity we have in terms of winning the war. And we think that when you have a developing country versus a developed country, we think that these resources give them a greater advantage, and this leads to that unfairness actually being created. So how does the introduction of super soldiers, if I can, yes, they are super soldiers. How does the introduction of super soldiers actually change the way in which war actually occurs? So we think that when we look at it in terms of war entirely, we don't think that it's any country would just willingly want to go into war. And we think that that's because of the effects that the war has. So in status quo, when we have war, we have lots of lives that are lost, as even the grade 8s knew that. And wars tend to take long in order to actually end them. So we think that when you introduce super soldiers, you actually considering the nature of these super soldiers, the way in which they go about in terms of actually achieving some form of change in our country is actually different. So these super soldiers have less human error in them in terms that they can mitigate. So in an example where we have ISIS attacking people in a hospital, we think that in status quo what we would do is to bomb the entire hospital, and that would result in a loss of many lives. But we think that when we have super soldiers, we have more accuracy in terms of how we deal with war. And we think that strategy is something that is important in war, which is why it would mean that these superhumans will actually go and attack just that ISIS killer. And also, in terms of overfast and cheap, we also feel that the reason why any government would hate a war is because of the aftermath of war. So bombings occur during wars, and this would mean that the government actually has to re-establish what is actually happening in the country and recreate infrastructure that is lost, together with the many graveyards that it will also have. So another question that we want to answer in today's debate is, when do we go into war? So we as side proposition believe that we go into war when there's just cause, and it's the last resort in terms of going to cause. And also furthermore, what we as side proposition believe is that any country which will go into war needs to take into consideration as to whether we have the mechanisms to deal with the possible fallouts that may occur. And we think that this will still exist even under our model that we are introducing in today's debate. But before I move on, yes, Sia.
Also, why are you lying to us? We don't go to war because of a just cause. We go to war because we're selfish and want profit. When Russia and America have super soldiers, there's a greater amount to them just disenfranchising other countries. And we think that's incredibly problematic in terms of equality.
Thank you, Sia. I was actually going to get to America in my speech. And thank you to you two for lying to us and telling us we don't go to war because we want to make a profit. Well, as much as that may be the problem, but I think the fact that we make so much loss in terms of infrastructure and the country on its own means that we don't make any profit. But to deal with the issue of when you speak about America invading Afghanistan, if that's what you mentioned, I'm not sure which war you spoke about since there are so many. But when you look at it in terms of that way, we need to look at it in terms of how we have the unfair playing field and how, this was my point, mechanisms to deal with possible fallouts. So we look at it in terms of how when we have America going and invading this country, trying to make the profit that Sia believes we're making it, we need to look at it in terms of how we actually have mechanisms in society that can only reach a certain capacity to actually try and mitigate the harms that this America would have, and that would be like bodies, the external bodies like the UN. So we think that the reason why we place so much emphasis on the United Nations, or why we would regard the United Nations as a body that's able to provide us with resources in terms of actually implementing our policy, we think it's the fact that we need to look at it in terms of the International Criminal Court, a court that's supposed to uphold the rights of most civilians, of most people from our country, our world. And we think that the fact that so little crimes actually went there means that intervention from these bodies is something that's highly approachable. And secondly, and also, we think that when we look at it in terms of super soldiers, we need to look at it in terms of how they have made an oath to their country to actually want to survive and make a change. And we think for these reasons, super soldiers should stay.
Professor X for that interesting speech. Also, thank you to their school for having such a creative war cry. I just wish you guys could have come up with more creative names. I would now like to call the first speaker of the opposition, Gemma Muthen, to begin the case for the
Solvista has already lost 2 senior finals in a row, and we intend on making that a habit. And for this reason, I am proud to oppose. Okay, so before we move on to anything, in today's debate, we believe that before we propose super soldiers, that's only onto the last resort. And we believe that we have an alternative forward, and this is to show war. So we believe that by showing war, we'll be showing like mutilations and people dying, and we'll be broadcasting these videos. And this is what it means. So it means that we see that people are now going to care more, and before, when people don't know about war, like people don't know about what's happening in Iraq and how many deaths are in Iraq, we see that when we broadcast war, we see that people more, care about war, and also then allow for accountability.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, people know about war. You don't need to actually go watching it in videos for them to know that we go into war and there's going to be expenses, there's going to be lack of accountability currently existing, and that's a major problem we aim to achieve.
We see that people know, okay, this is what's happening in war, but they don't know the deaths, the number of deaths that are happening. They don't know about the mutilations. And we see that when we have people caring about war, we see that the governments are going to start to be more accountable, decline. And when they are more accountable, we see that this allows for like other countries to now place these like sanctions over these governments. So we accept the definition brought forth by side proposition, but we clash on ground that the creation of super soldiers are counterproductive to the role of government and to the right of consenting. In our case split for today, we have the role. I'll be speaking about the role of government and the nature of war, and my second speaker will speak about war engineering and accountability. So so now I move on to my rebuttal. So we have from Enkosi coming up here and talking to us about accountability and the nature of war. And he stated that super soldiers achieve a big change by accuracy than with normal human soldiers. And we see that this doesn't really make sense, because super soldiers, when they are injected with the serum, we see that these soldiers, their empathy genes are deleted and they therefore show no mercy. So, and this is through research, and we see that this will therefore, if they are only supposed to kill, they are just going to start killing. There's no control over their decline. Okay, and we see that he also stated that it will become more unfair with having it will become
Gemma,
more. Yes.
So we told you quite clearly in our first speech that we would allow these super soldiers to go into war on condition that they have a mechanism in which the justice system has the capability to account for their bad actions in these specific circumstances.
Yeah, but you see that in the serum that's injected into them, there's all these human qualities that are taken out, so they lose their humanity. And if they're going to lose their humanity, they're just going to be able to kill people, and this increases war, and this doesn't mitigate war, but it basically perpetuates war.
Gemma?
Decline. And we see that, to close my rebuttal, we see that they said that it doesn't achieve equalities, and we see that it won't achieve equalities because we have a developing nation and then we have a developed nation. These serums aren't going to be cheap, they're going to be much more expensive. And if they are much more expensive, we see that only the developed nations will be able to have this, like Russia, China, and US. Decline. Okay, so now I move on to my matter. Today, I'll be talking about the role of government and the nature of war. Under the role of government, I'm going to be talking about the obligation to protect society and how super soldiers will be inciting war. And then under the nature of war, I'll be talking about why having super soldiers becomes unfair and what actually happens in war. Decline. So under the role or the obligation of the government. So we see that in every society, the role and obligation of the government is to protect the society from harm. And we see that, as I've mentioned before, on how super soldiers will be actually increasing the number of deaths. Decline. They'll actually be increasing the number of deaths. They basically are inciting war. And with inciting war, we need the government government to now step in and to protect the people. So we see that this is bad. And we also see that if ISIS or Boko Haram get their hands on these serums, how the mass destruction that they can bring to the world makes this negative to society. So now we move on to like what happens
Gemma.
with decline. Okay, and now we talk about like what happens during the war and like the nature of war. So why is it unfair if we have these super soldiers? So as I mentioned before, decline. As I mentioned before, that this serum will be really expensive. So if it's really expensive, we see that the developed nations will have this advantage over, and this is how it makes war even more unfair. So you'll have this whole concept of how super soldiers won't make, you'll have this wrong concept on how war is like going to be more unfair. But technically, if we have these like super soldiers, it makes it more unfair because we're going to have, it makes it more unfair because the developing nations decline. The developing nations now don't have all these, or doesn't have the money in order to allow for these serums. So we see decline. So we see that what happens through war. So we have these human beings that are now going to go through this excrucial pain and torture in war, and they become brainwashed. And now when they have to decline, and now when they have to come into society, how do they come into society? Because they have these psychological traumas. And yes, rehabilitation doesn't work. Because if these people now become angry, they go on to this like rampage, and now we see that society is at harm. We also see that these decline. These super soldiers can't opt out of what they are, what they become, and so their choice is affected. And some won't even be able to like survive this. And we see that even though some would consent on becoming a super soldier, we believe that the harms will outweigh the consent, and therefore we just don't want this in today's debate. And we see that how the choice, if the choice was even rational, the military has the ability to exploit these people as well. So in today's debate, I've shown you that because it's the role of the government to protect people, we see that super soldiers will bring more harm, and therefore it won't protect the people. And I've showed you that, and I've showed you that even in the nature of war, it becomes more unfair to the developing countries. And in war, how these people, when war ends, how they cannot go back into society. And for these reasons, the motion should do nothing but war.